So one of the challenges I've seen is that many of us in the field of disasters, we have one mode, it's kind of doom and gloom, right? We go out and say, you're going to die, right? Things are going to go really, really badly. You'll have no food for 3 days. We found there's a different way to do this. In New Zealand, for example, in Wellington, WREMO, the Wellington Regional Management Organization, REMO, they spend time not on doom and gloom, but building trust. 1/3 of their office personnel are out of their office every day, embedded in schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, PTA groups, bocce ball clubs. They spend 1/3 of their time outside the office building trust with local organizations. Why? Because if you trust you during normal times, they're going to come to you during those crisis times as well. Right now, 1/10 of the traffic that goes through Facebook is on their page. Nothing to do with disasters. Local colleges have a party, they advertise it on their page. Local people want to get rid of stuff, they advertise it on their page. This page is the go-to point because it's trusted by individuals. When that big earthquake comes to New Zealand, as it will, and tsunami warnings come, as they will, REMO is positioned now to be trusted by individuals living nearby. So their method has been to build trust through being there in the community, not just at times of crisis, but all the entire year. Yeah, this is a hard one because we found, whether it's North America, India, Japan, or Israel, these ties are often idiosyncratic, meaning we can't predict why you might have them. Maybe you're a friend of the mayor or the governor. Maybe you had some kind of workshop there in Washington, D.C. or at FEMA. Really hard for us to predict them. So what we found is encouraging local managers to think through who's above them, to meet them ahead of time. So we often encourage, for example, in India, people have often never met the local people they work with and representatives, politicians and bureaucrats. We encourage them to use email and phones to get in touch with them. Here in North America, it might be a workshop that we have, bringing local regional representatives to a local communities that's vulnerable, like Gulf Coast, for example, or sending those people out from the city to meet people nearby. Oftentimes, we really don't know who they are until the disaster. This is the old talk about, exchanging business cards at the site of the disaster is too late. So anything that we can do early, ahead of time, for local community members, but also people in DC or wherever else they are, making those decisions, get to know the community, right? Those individuals, those ties will be critical later on. I think it's even worse than that. We've asked people all the time, who helped you? We ask people who've been through disasters in North America and elsewhere, who helped you when you were in trouble? They say something like this: oh, it was FEMA. Even if FEMA wasn't even the area nearby, it was the Red Cross, it was an NGO nearby, it was a church. Oftentimes, individuals who've been through disasters simply don't recognize who they're working with. And this is a real challenge for us, I think, in the disaster field. There's no recognition of local versus regional versus national. People I've talked to assume FEMA will be there with pickaxes, oxygen masks, and door cutters. I think we all know that's not going to happen in most cases, right? Maybe some of you guys volunteer in the free time, but that's not going to happen. So this is a real challenge. Most North Americans, at least, simply don't know that much about what FEMA does, or what organizations like the Red Cross do, or how those lines do or don't connect. So part of the process of educating the community is, before the disaster, again, telling them this is the framework that we have. It's the NRDF framework that we have. This is the local community framework that we have. San Francisco, for example, has a lot of meetings every month just to tell people this is the people that you might work with. Here's the NGOs nearby. Here's the local organizations nearby. Here's the city government. Here's the California government. And here's FEMA. They spend time looking sure local leaders know who those individuals are, so you don't have that kind of confusion during the disaster. Yeah, this is a big problem. What we've found is that horizontal ties are much easier to cultivate, right? So encouraging communities to get outside, to meet their neighbors, to volunteer. Much harder to tell individuals, go write a letter to your politician, go visit them in DC or in Tokyo in this case. It's also kind of inequitable at some levels, right? Meaning if you have those politicians who you know well and they're actively working for you in the center of power, it's a very different story than a community nearby that also went through the disaster that doesn't have those vertical ties. So this is a challenge, I think, for us to think through the ethics of disaster recovery. I know certainly in North America, we have plenty of data that shows better connected communities get money first. They get money more quickly. We also know, for example, that block grants, which I think are ending, if I remember correctly, haven't been given out so randomly either. There's several papers that we've written as a team that show disaster aid is politicized. It is politicized, both international and domestic, meaning we give aid to certain countries more quickly, other countries not as much. And internally, the aid itself doesn't flow as equally across, despite our best efforts to help those who've been damaged. So I think this is a real point where the data show, despite our best hopes, that disaster aid comes to those who need it. I think that the reality is that disaster help comes to those who are connected to other people. And that's a problem, right? Building those horizontal and vertical ties. I'm not sure there's an easy answer that we can have that will make it more equitable across the society right now. It's interesting. People often assume Japan is best situated, most homogeneous country, a lot of social conformity. The reality is there's variation even in Japan. So even those cities I mentioned along the coast in Japan had huge variations in social tie levels and trust as well. I always argue like this: even in societies like Japan or places like New York City, we might imagine is much more heterogeneous, there's pockets of strong social ties and neighborhoods right nearby where it's really, really weak. It's almost like a checkerboard in a sense. New Orleans is the same thing. When we lived in New Orleans, we had places like Lakeview, Ninth Ward, Broadmoor. Those communities themselves might be well connected to each other or internally, but not well externally. So I'm not sure there's only one country that's done it right. I know for a fact that New Zealand and Japan have tried to invest in social capital in a way that I'm not quite sure we're quite there yet in North America. Many people that I talk to at the local level agree with me that social ties matter. Then I ask for funding, and then the conversation gets a lot quieter, right? So, how do we go from agreeing the idea that these ties are measurable, for example, that they can be captured just like any other social tie or physical tie, but that we need to invest in them. Right now, for example, Boulder, Colorado has a great program called BOCO Strong, a very localized program run by citizens there in Boulder that builds these kind of social ties. I mentioned San Francisco and Boston. Both those cities have chief resilience officers working from the Rockefeller cities, working on ideas of social cohesion as well. So I see pockets of areas that are doing it well. I haven't really seen one country where it's, let's say, uniformly doing well across the country. This is a great question. So we've noticed that basically it's strongly demographic by age who uses these kind of platforms, Nextdoor, Facebook, and so forth. We think they've got great potential to do this because they have information on where we are. If you're holding a phone right now, it's probably telling someone else where you are in this building in Washington, D.C. So we'd like to increase social network use, especially among the elderly, who often can't get out of their homes. And certainly in Japan as well, there are attempts to train individuals over 70, over 75, and having a phone or a platform they can work on, a tablet often larger than a phone, so it's more easy to see. So we think there's a possibility, but again, we need funds in these communities and focus on them, recognizing these are a lifeline in many cases for individuals who can't get out. We found, of course, in all these disasters, the most vulnerable populations are the elderly. So the more that we can do to build social ties through media, I think would be a great plan.